The snow fell softly, blanketing the city in a quiet, white stillness. The streets were empty, the shops closed, and the only sound was the distant chime of church bells ringing in Christmas Eve. In the heart of the park, where the lampposts cast long shadows on the frozen ground, a man sat alone on a bench. He was dressed in an expensive coat, his hands gloved in fine leather, but his face was etched with a deep, unshakable sadness. This was a man who had everything: wealth, power, influence, and yet, he had nothing at all. He stared at the snow-covered trees, his breath visible in the cold air. The park was his escape, the one place where he could be alone with his thoughts. But tonight, even the solitude felt heavy, like a weight pressing down on his chest. He had no family, no friends, no one to share his life with. He was a sterile millionaire, a man who had built an empire but had no one to leave it to. As he sat there, lost in his thoughts, a small figure emerged from the shadows. It was a girl, no more than 10 years old, dressed in tattered clothes and barefoot despite the freezing cold. Her face was pale, her cheeks red from the chill, but her eyes were bright, almost glowing with an otherworldly light. She walked toward him with purpose, her small feet crunching in the snow. The man looked up, startled. "What are you doing out here?" he asked, his voice sharp but not unkind. "It's freezing. You should be home." The girl stopped in front of him, her breath forming little clouds in the air. She didn't answer his question. Instead, she reached into the pocket of her ragged coat and pulled out a small, intricately designed box. It was no bigger than her palm, made of a strange, shimmering metal that seemed to catch the light in unusual ways. She held it out to him, her small hands trembling. "Merry Christmas, Father," she said softly. The man froze. His heart skipped a beat, and for a moment, he couldn't breathe. "What did you say?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The girl didn't repeat herself. She simply placed the box in his hands, her fingers brushing against his for the briefest moment. Her touch was warm, almost too warm for someone who had been out in the cold. Then, before he could say another word, she turned and walked away, disappearing into the shadows as quickly as she had come. The man sat there, stunned, the box resting heavily in his hands. He looked down at it, his mind racing. The surface of the box was smooth, with no visible seams or hinges. It was unlike anything he had ever seen before. He turned it over, examining it from every angle, but there was no way to open it. No latch, no keyhole, nothing. "Wait," he called out, standing up and looking around. But the girl was gone. The park was empty once more, the only sound the soft crunch of snow beneath his feet. He sat back down, his heart pounding. Who was she? Why had she called him father? And what was this box? Questions swirled in his mind, each one more unsettling than the last. He felt a strange mix of emotions: curiosity, fear, and something else, something he couldn't quite name. It was as if the girl had awakened something inside him, something he had buried long ago. For the first time in years, the millionaire felt alive. The millionaire returned to his penthouse that night, the box clutched tightly in his hands. The elevator ride to the top floor felt longer than usual, the silence pressing in on him. When the doors finally opened, he stepped into a world of luxury: polished marble floors, floor-to-ceiling windows, and furniture that cost more than most people earned in a lifetime. But the grandeur felt hollow, the emptiness of the space echoing the emptiness inside him. He placed the box on the glass coffee table and sat down, staring at it. The shimmering metal seemed to pulse faintly, as if it had a life of its own. He reached out to touch it, his fingers tracing the smooth surface. Still, there was no way to open it. No latch, no keyhole, no buttons. It was a puzzle, and he was determined to solve it. But as the hours passed, his frustration grew. He tried everything, prying it open with a knife, heating it, even dropping it, but nothing worked. The box remained stubbornly closed, its secrets locked away. Finally, exhausted, he leaned back on the couch and closed his eyes. The image of the girl flashed in his mind, her bright eyes, her trembling hands, the way she had called him father. It didn't make sense. He had no children. He had no one. The next morning, he woke up early, the box still on the table. He had dreamed of the girl, though the details were hazy. All he remembered was her voice, soft and urgent, saying, "Find me." He didn't know what it meant, but he couldn't shake the feeling that she was trying to tell him something. He spent the day in his office, trying to focus on work, but his mind kept wandering back to the box and the girl. His assistant noticed his distraction and asked if everything was all right, but he brushed her off. He didn't want to talk about it. How could he explain something he didn't understand himself? That evening, he returned to the park. The snow had stopped falling, but the ground was still covered in a thick white blanket. He walked to the bench where he had met the girl, hoping she would be there. But the park was empty, the only sound the crunch of snow beneath his boots. He sat down, the cold seeping through his coat. He didn't know why he had come back. Maybe he thought she would return. Maybe he just needed to feel close to her, to the mystery she had brought into his life. As he sat there, he noticed something he hadn't seen before, a small footprint in the snow, leading away from the bench. It was faint, almost erased by the wind, but it was there. He followed the footprints, his heart pounding with a mix of hope and fear. They led him out of the park and into the city, through narrow alleys and dimly lit streets. The further he went, the more the surroundings changed. The clean, well-maintained buildings gave way to crumbling facades and boarded-up windows. This was a part of the city he rarely visited, a place where poverty and despair were etched into every corner. Finally, the footprints stopped in front of a small, dilapidated building. The sign above the door was faded, but he could just make out the words, "St. Mary's Shelter." He hesitated, unsure of what to do. This was not his world. He had spent his life avoiding places like this, places that reminded him of the struggles he had left behind. But something drew him inside. The door creaked as he pushed it open, revealing a dimly lit room filled with people, men, women, and children, all huddled together for warmth. The air was thick with the smell of damp clothes and unwashed bodies. He felt out of place, his expensive coat and polished shoes a stark contrast to the worn-out clothes around him. A woman approached him, her face lined with age and hardship. "Can I help you?" she asked, her voice tired but kind. "I'm looking for a girl," he said, his voice trembling. "She's about 10 years old, barefoot, wearing tattered clothes. She gave me this." He held up the box, his hands shaking. The woman's eyes widened. "You've seen her?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Yes," he said. "Do you know who she is?" The woman hesitated, then nodded. "Come with me." She led him to a small room at the back of the shelter. The walls were covered in drawings, crude but colorful depictions of people, animals, and strange, futuristic machines. In the center of the room was a table, and on the table was a small, handmade doll. It was dressed in tattered clothes, just like the girl. "She comes here sometimes," the woman said. "No one knows where she lives or who her family is. But she's different. She helps people, even though she has nothing herself. And she talks about things no child should know." "What kind of things?" he asked, his heart racing. The woman looked at him, her eyes filled with a mixture of fear and awe. "She talks about the future." The millionaire stood in the small room, staring at the drawings on the walls. They were unlike anything he had ever seen, vivid, almost lifelike depictions of cities that didn't exist, machines that looked like they belonged in a science fiction movie, and people dressed in strange, futuristic clothing. In one corner of the room, there was a drawing of a man who looked eerily like him, standing next to the beggar girl. The caption beneath it read, "Father and Daughter." His heart raced as he turned to the woman. "What do you mean, she talks about the future?" he asked, his voice trembling. The woman hesitated, as if unsure how much to say. "She's not like other children," she began. "She knows things she shouldn't. She predicted the storm last month, days before it happened. She told us where to find food when the supplies ran low. And she's always talking about a man who will change everything." The millionaire's mind was spinning. "Do you think she's from the future?" he asked, the words feeling strange on his tongue. The woman shrugged. "I don't know what to think. All I know is that she's special. And she's been waiting for you." "For me?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The woman nodded. "She said you would come. She said you would bring the box." The millionaire looked down at the box in his hands, its surface shimmering faintly in the dim light. He felt a mix of emotions, fear, curiosity, and something else, something he couldn't quite name. It was as if the box was calling to him, urging him to open it, to uncover its secrets. "Where is she now?" he asked, his voice urgent. "I don't know," the woman said. "She comes and goes. But if she wants to see you, she'll find you." The millionaire left the shelter that night with more questions than answers. The girl was a mystery, a puzzle he couldn't solve. But one thing was clear, she was connected to him in some way. And he needed to find out how. Over the next few days, he became obsessed with the girl and the box. He spent hours in his penthouse, staring at the box, trying to figure out how to open it. He researched futuristic technology, time travel, anything that might explain what was happening. But nothing made sense. The box was unlike anything anyone had ever seen. Meanwhile, he began to visit the shelter regularly, hoping to catch a glimpse of the girl. He brought food, clothes, and blankets, trying to help in any way he could. The people there were wary of him at first, but slowly, they began to accept him. They told him stories about the girl, how she had helped them, how she had saved lives, how she had always spoken of a man who would change the world. One evening, as he was leaving the shelter, he saw her. She was standing at the end of the alley, her small figure silhouetted against the dim light of a street lamp. His heart leaped, and he started toward her, but she turned and ran. "Wait," he called out, chasing after her. But she was fast, darting through the narrow streets with the agility of a cat. He followed her, his breath coming in short gasps, until she disappeared into an abandoned building. He hesitated at the entrance, his heart pounding. The building was dark and crumbling, the windows boarded up, the door hanging off its hinges. But he had come this far, and he couldn't turn back now. He stepped inside, the floor creaking beneath his feet. The air was thick with dust, and the only light came from the moon shining through the cracks in the walls. He called out, his voice echoing in the empty space. "I'm not here to hurt you," he said. "I just want to talk." There was no answer. He moved further into the building, his eyes adjusting to the darkness. In the corner of the room, he saw a small figure huddled under a blanket. It was her. He approached slowly, not wanting to scare her. "Please," he said softly. "I need to know who you are. Why did you give me this box? Why did you call me father?" The girl looked up at him, her bright eyes glowing in the dim light. For a moment, she said nothing. Then, she reached out and touched the box in his hands. "Open it," she whispered. "I've tried," he said, his voice desperate. "I can't." The girl shook her head. "Not with your hands. With your heart." He didn't understand what she meant, but before he could ask, she stood up and walked away, disappearing into the shadows once more. The millionaire stood in the abandoned building, the box clutched tightly in his hands. The girl's words echoed in his mind, "Not with your hands. With your heart." He didn't understand what she meant, but he knew he had to try. He closed his eyes and took a deep breath, trying to quiet his racing thoughts. For the first time in years, he allowed himself to feel. He thought about his life, the wealth, the power, the loneliness. He thought about the girl and the way she had looked at him, as if she knew him better than he knew himself. He thought about the people at the shelter, the ones who had nothing but still found a way to help each other. And he thought about the box, the strange, shimmering object that had brought him here. As he stood there, a strange warmth spread through his chest. It was as if the box was responding to his emotions, to the vulnerability he had buried for so long. He opened his eyes and looked down at the box. The surface was glowing now, the light pulsing in time with his heartbeat. Suddenly, the box began to change. The smooth surface split open, revealing a complex network of gears and lights. In the center was a small, glowing orb, hovering in mid-air. The millionaire stared at it, his breath caught in his throat. The orb began to expand, forming a holographic image in front of him. It was the girl. But she was older now, a young woman with the same bright eyes and kind smile. She looked at him with a mixture of sadness and hope, and when she spoke, her voice was soft but clear. "Hello, father," she said. The millionaire's heart skipped a beat. "Who are you?" he asked, his voice trembling. "I'm your daughter," she said. "From the future." He felt a wave of disbelief and confusion. "That's impossible," he said. "I have no children." "Not yet," she said. "But you will. And I was sent back to change the course of history." The millionaire's mind was spinning. "What are you talking about?" he asked. The holographic image shifted, showing a bleak, dystopian future. The cities were in ruins, the skies dark with smoke, and the people were struggling to survive. The girl's voice filled the air, explaining what had happened. "In the future, humanity is on the brink of collapse," she said. "The world is divided, the rich hoarding resources while the poor suffer. You were one of the richest men in the world, but you used your wealth to exploit others, to build walls instead of bridges. And because of that, the world fell apart." The millionaire felt a pang of guilt. He had always known his wealth came at a cost, but he had never allowed himself to think about it. Now, the truth was staring him in the face. "But it doesn't have to be this way," the girl continued. "You have the power to change the future. To use your wealth to help others, to bring people together instead of tearing them apart. That's why I came back, to show you what's at stake, and to give you a chance to make things right." The holographic image faded, leaving the millionaire alone in the dark building. He felt a mix of emotions, shock, guilt, and a strange sense of hope. The girl's words had struck a chord deep within him, awakening something he had buried long ago. He looked down at the box, now closed and silent once more. But he knew what he had to do. He had to change. Not just for himself, but for the girl, for the future, for the world. The millionaire left the abandoned building that night with a newfound sense of purpose. The girl's words echoed in his mind, urging him to act, to change the course of his life and, in turn, the future. But where to begin? He had spent decades building his empire, amassing wealth, and isolating himself from the world. Now, he had to tear down those walls, brick by brick. The first thing he did was return to the shelter. The people there were surprised to see him so late at night, but they welcomed him with cautious smiles. He sat down with the woman who had first told him about the girl and explained what he had seen. He didn't mention the hologram or the future, those details were too unbelievable, but he told her he wanted to help. "I want to make a difference," he said. "But I don't know how. I need your guidance." The woman studied him for a moment, then nodded. "Start small," she said. "Help the people here. Listen to their stories. Understand their struggles. Then, you'll know what to do." And so, he did. Over the next few days, he spent hours at the shelter, talking to the people who came seeking warmth and food. He listened to their stories, of lost jobs, broken families, and dreams that had been crushed by circumstance. He heard about their struggles, but also their resilience, their hope, and their determination to keep going. One man, a former factory worker, told him about how he had lost everything when the factory closed down. "I just want to work again," he said. "To provide for my family. But no one will hire me." A young mother shared how she had fled an abusive relationship with her 2 children. "We have nothing," she said. "But I'll do whatever it takes to keep them safe." Each story touched him in a way he hadn't expected. For the first time in his life, he felt connected to others, to their pain and their hopes. And with each story, he began to see a path forward. He started by using his wealth to fund small projects, repairing the shelter, providing warm clothes and blankets, and organizing job training programs. He hired the former factory worker to help with the repairs, giving him a sense of purpose and dignity. He helped the young mother find a safe place to live and enrolled her in a program to learn new skills. Word of his efforts spread quickly, and soon, others came forward to help. Local businesses donated supplies, volunteers offered their time, and the community began to come together in a way it hadn't in years. The millionaire was amazed at what could be achieved when people worked together. But not everyone was happy with his actions. One evening, as he was leaving the shelter, he was approached by a group of men in expensive suits. They were business associates, men he had known for years, and they didn't look pleased. "What are you doing?" one of them asked, his voice sharp. "You're throwing your money away on these people. They'll never change. They'll never be like us." The millionaire looked at them, his resolve hardening. "Maybe that's the problem," he said. "We've spent too long thinking we're better than them. But we're not. We're all human. And if we don't help each other, what's the point of all this wealth?" The men stared at him, stunned. They didn't understand, and he knew they never would. But that didn't matter. He had found his purpose, and he wasn't going to let anyone stop him. As he walked away, he thought about the girl. He hadn't seen her since that night in the abandoned building, but he felt her presence everywhere, in the smiles of the people he had helped, in the hope that was slowly returning to the community, and in the warmth that had begun to fill his own heart. He didn't know what the future held, but he knew one thing for certain: he was no longer the man he had been. He was changing, and with that change, he hoped to change the world. Weeks passed, and the millionaire's efforts began to bear fruit. The shelter was now a bustling hub of activity, filled with people learning new skills, sharing meals, and supporting one another. The community was coming alive, and the millionaire felt a sense of fulfillment he had never known before. But despite the progress, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was missing. The girl. He hadn't seen her since that night in the abandoned building, and her absence weighed heavily on him. He often found himself looking for her in the crowd, hoping to catch a glimpse of her bright eyes or hear her soft voice. But she was nowhere to be found. One evening, as he was walking home from the shelter, he felt a strange pull, as if something was calling him. Without thinking, he changed direction, following the feeling through the narrow streets until he found himself standing in front of the abandoned building once more. The door creaked as he pushed it open, the sound echoing in the empty space. The air was cold, and the moonlight streaming through the cracks in the walls cast eerie shadows on the floor. He stepped inside, his heart pounding. "Hello?" he called out, his voice trembling. There was no answer. He moved further into the building, his footsteps echoing in the silence. Just as he was about to turn back, he saw her. She was sitting in the corner, her small figure huddled under a blanket. Her face was pale, her eyes tired, but she smiled when she saw him. "You came," she said softly. The millionaire's heart leaped. He rushed to her side, kneeling down so he was at her level. "Where have you been?" he asked, his voice filled with concern. "I've been looking for you." The girl shook her head. "I can't stay long," she said. "My time here is almost up." "What do you mean?" he asked, his voice trembling. The girl looked at him, her eyes filled with a mixture of sadness and hope. "I was sent back to help you," she said. "To show you the path. But I can't stay forever. The future needs me too." The millionaire felt a pang of fear. "But I need you," he said. "I don't know what to do without you." The girl reached out and took his hand. Her touch was warm, comforting. "You don't need me," she said. "You have everything you need inside you. You just have to believe in yourself." Tears filled the millionaire's eyes. "But I'm not strong enough," he said. "I'm just one man. How can I change the world?" The girl smiled. "You're not just one man," she said. "You're a father. A leader. A beacon of hope. And you're not alone. You have the people. They believe in you. They'll stand by you." The millionaire looked at her, his heart swelling with emotion. For the first time, he saw her not just as a mysterious girl from the future, but as the daughter he had never had. He felt a deep, unshakable bond with her, a connection that went beyond time and space. "I don't want to lose you," he said, his voice breaking. The girl's smile faded, and she looked at him with a mixture of love and sorrow. "You won't lose me," she said. "I'll always be with you. In your heart. In your actions. In the future you're building." She reached into her pocket and pulled out a small, folded piece of paper. She handed it to him, her hands trembling. "Take this," she said. "It's a map. It will guide you." The millionaire took the paper, his hands shaking. He unfolded it and saw a series of coordinates and notes, written in a language he didn't understand. But he knew it was important. He knew it was the key to the next step in his journey. "Thank you," he said, his voice filled with gratitude. The girl nodded, her eyes closing as if she was exhausted. "I have to go now," she said softly. "But I'll see you again. In the future." Before he could say another word, she disappeared, fading into the shadows as if she had never been there. The millionaire sat there, stunned, the piece of paper clutched tightly in his hands. For a long time, he didn't move. He just sat there, thinking about the girl and her words. He thought about the future, about the world he was trying to build, and about the love he felt for the daughter he had never known. Finally, he stood up, his resolve stronger than ever. He had a map. He had a mission. And he had the strength to see it through. The millionaire sat in his penthouse, the piece of paper the girl had given him spread out on the table. The coordinates and notes were still a mystery, but he was determined to decipher them. He spent hours researching, cross-referencing the numbers with maps and databases, until he finally found a match. The coordinates pointed to an old, abandoned factory on the outskirts of the city. It was a place he had heard of before, a symbol of the city's industrial decline, now forgotten and left to decay. But why would the girl send him there? What could possibly be in that factory? The next morning, he set out to find answers. He drove to the factory, the city gradually giving way to empty fields and crumbling buildings. When he arrived, he was struck by the sheer size of the place. The factory loomed like a giant, its broken windows and rusted walls a testament to its former glory. He stepped inside, the air thick with dust and the smell of decay. The factory was eerily quiet, the only sound the crunch of broken glass beneath his feet. He followed the coordinates to a specific area, a large room filled with old machinery and discarded equipment. In the center of the room was a strange device, a machine unlike anything he had ever seen. It was sleek and futuristic, with glowing panels and intricate wiring. Attached to it was a small screen, displaying a countdown, 72 hours. 72 hours. The millionaire's heart raced as he realized what he was looking at. This was no ordinary machine. It was a weapon, one capable of causing unimaginable destruction. And it was set to activate in 3 days. He felt a surge of panic. Who had built this? Why was it here? And how was he supposed to stop it? As he stood there, trying to make sense of it all, he heard a noise behind him. He turned around, his heart pounding, and saw a group of men entering the room. They were dressed in black, their faces hidden behind masks, and they were armed. "Step away from the machine," one of them said, his voice cold and commanding. The millionaire raised his hands, his mind racing. "Who are you?" he asked. "What is this?" The man ignored his questions. "You shouldn't have come here," he said. "This doesn't concern you." "It concerns everyone," the millionaire shot back. "If this thing activates, it will destroy the city. Maybe more." The men exchanged glances, but they didn't lower their weapons. "You don't understand," the leader said. "This is bigger than you. Bigger than all of us." Before the millionaire could respond, there was a loud crash from the other side of the room. The men turned, distracted, and in that moment, the millionaire saw his chance. He grabbed a piece of broken metal from the floor and threw it at the machine, hitting one of the panels. The machine sparked, the countdown flickering. The men shouted, rushing to stop him, but he was already running. He darted through the factory, his heart pounding, the sound of footsteps close behind. He didn't know where he was going, but he knew he had to get out. He had to find help. He had to stop the machine. As he ran, he thought about the girl. She had given him the map for a reason. She had trusted him to do the right thing. And he wouldn't let her down. He burst out of the factory, the cold air hitting him like a slap. He ran to his car, jumped inside, and sped away, the factory disappearing in the rearview mirror. The millionaire drove back to the city, his mind racing. He had only 3 days to stop the machine, but he didn't know where to start. He needed help, but who could he trust? The men in black had made it clear that this was bigger than him, and he couldn't risk involving anyone who might be part of the conspiracy. As he pulled into the city, an idea struck him. He drove straight to the shelter, hoping to find the woman who had helped him before. She was wise, resourceful, and had connections in the community. If anyone could help him, it was her. When he arrived, the shelter was bustling with activity. People were eating, talking, and laughing, a stark contrast to the danger he had just faced. He found the woman in the kitchen, helping prepare a meal. "I need your help," he said, his voice urgent. She looked at him, her eyes narrowing. "What's wrong?" He explained everything, the machine, the countdown, the men in black. Her face grew pale as she listened, but she didn't interrupt. When he finished, she nodded. "We'll help you," she said. "But we need to be careful. If these men are as dangerous as you say, we can't let them know what we're doing." Over the next 2 days, they worked in secret. The woman reached out to trusted friends, engineers, hackers, and activists, who could help dismantle the machine. The millionaire used his resources to gather tools and equipment, all while keeping a low profile. But time was running out. The countdown was now at midnight, and the pressure was mounting. The millionaire felt the weight of the world on his shoulders, but he refused to give up. He couldn't. Too much was at stake. On the final day, they returned to the factory. The group moved quickly and quietly, avoiding the men in black who patrolled the area. When they reached the machine, they got to work, disconnecting wires, disabling panels, and trying to stop the countdown. But it wasn't enough. The machine was too advanced, its systems too complex. No matter what they did, the countdown continued. 6 hours. 5 hours 59 minutes and 59 seconds. 5 hours 59 minutes and 58 seconds. The millionaire felt a surge of despair. They were running out of time, and he didn't know what to do. He thought about the girl, about her faith in him, and he felt a pang of guilt. He had failed her. He had failed everyone. Just as he was about to give up, he heard a voice behind him. "Father." He turned. But he knew this wasn't over. The countdown was still ticking. And he had only 3 days to stop it. The millionaire drove back to the city, his mind racing. He had only 3 days to stop the machine, but he didn't know where to start. He needed help, but who could he trust? The men in black had made it clear that this was bigger than him, and he couldn't risk involving anyone who might be part of the conspiracy. As he pulled into the city, an idea struck him. He drove straight to the shelter, hoping to find the woman who had helped him before. She was wise, resourceful, and had connections in the community. If anyone could help him, it was her. When he arrived, the shelter was bustling with activity. People were eating, talking, and laughing, a stark contrast to the danger he had just faced. He found the woman in the kitchen, helping prepare a meal. "I need your help," he said, his voice urgent. She looked at him, her eyes narrowing. "What's wrong?" He explained everything, the machine, the countdown, the men in black. Her face grew pale as she listened, but she didn't interrupt. When he finished, she nodded. "We'll help you," she said. "But we need to be careful. If these men are as dangerous as you say, we can't let them know what we're doing." Over the next 2 days, they worked in secret. The woman reached out to trusted friends, engineers, hackers, and activists, who could help dismantle the machine. The millionaire used his resources to gather tools and equipment, all while keeping a low profile. But time was running out. The countdown was now at midnight, and the pressure was mounting. The millionaire felt the weight of the world on his shoulders, but he refused to give up. He couldn't. Too much was at stake. On the final day, they returned to the factory. The group moved quickly and quietly, avoiding the men in black who patrolled the area. When they reached the machine, they got to work, disconnecting wires, disabling panels, and trying to stop the countdown. But it wasn't enough. The machine was too advanced, its systems too complex. No matter what they did, the countdown continued. 6 hours. 5 hours 59 minutes and 59 seconds. 5 hours 59 minutes and 58 seconds. The millionaire felt a surge of despair. They were running out of time, and he didn't know what to do. He thought about the girl, about her faith in him, and he felt a pang of guilt. He had failed her. He had failed everyone. Just as he was about to give up, he heard a voice behind him. "Father." He turned around, his heart leaping. It was the girl. She was standing there, her bright eyes filled with determination. "You came," he said, his voice trembling. She nodded. "I told you I would." "But how?" he asked. "I thought you were gone." "I had to come back," she said. "To finish what I started." She walked over to the machine, her small hands moving quickly over the controls. The countdown stopped, the numbers freezing at 1 minute and 23 seconds. The millionaire felt a surge of relief, but it was short-lived. The machine began to hum, the panels glowing brighter and brighter. The girl turned to him, her face filled with sadness. "It's too late to stop it," she said. "But I can redirect the energy. I can send it somewhere safe." "No," he said, his voice breaking. "There has to be another way." She shook her head. "This is the only way. But it will cost me." He felt a wave of panic. "What do you mean?" She looked at him, her eyes filled with love. "I have to stay here," she said. "To hold the energy. To make sure it doesn't destroy the city." "No," he shouted, tears streaming down his face. "I can't lose you. Not again." She reached out and took his hand. "You won't lose me," she said. "I'll always be with you. In your heart. In the future you're building. Before he could say another word, she stepped into the machine. The panels flared, the energy surging around her. She looked at him one last time, her smile filled with peace. "Goodbye, Father," she said. And then she was gone. The machine exploded in a burst of light, the energy shooting into the sky and dissipating harmlessly. The factory was left in ruins, but the city was safe. The millionaire fell to his knees, his heart shattered. He had lost her. The daughter he had never known, the girl who had changed his life, was gone. But as he sat there, surrounded by the wreckage, he felt a strange sense of peace. She had given him a second chance, not just for himself, but for the world. And he wouldn't waste it. The millionaire sat in the ruins of the factory, the weight of the girl's sacrifice heavy on his heart. The air was still, the chaos of the explosion replaced by an eerie silence. He felt empty, as if a part of him had been torn away. But amidst the grief, there was something else, a spark of determination, a resolve to honor her memory. He stood up, brushing the dust off his clothes, and looked around. The factory was destroyed, but the city was safe. The girl had given her life to protect it, and he couldn't let her sacrifice be in vain. He had to carry on her mission, to build the future she had believed in. Over the next few months, the millionaire threw himself into his work with a passion he had never known before. He used his wealth to fund projects that helped the poor, the homeless, and the forgotten. He rebuilt the shelter, turning it into a community center that offered education, healthcare, and job training. He worked with local leaders to create programs that brought people together, breaking down the barriers that had divided them for so long. The people of the city noticed the change in him. They saw a man who had once been cold and distant now filled with compassion and purpose. They began to trust him, to believe in him, and to follow his lead. Slowly but surely, the city began to change. The streets became cleaner, the neighborhood safer, and the people happier. But the millionaire never forgot the girl. He thought about her every day, her bright eyes and kind smile etched into his memory. He kept the piece of paper she had given him, the map that had started it all, in a small frame on his desk. It was a reminder of her, of the future she had fought for, and of the love she had shown him. One evening, as he was leaving the community center, he felt a strange pull, just like he had that night in the abandoned building. He followed the feeling, walking through the streets until he found himself in the park where he had first met the girl. The snow was falling softly, just like it had been that night, and the air was filled with the quiet magic of Christmas Eve. He sat down on the bench, the same bench where she had handed him the box, and looked up at the stars. For the first time in a long time, he felt at peace. He knew he had done his best, that he had honored her memory and made a difference in the world. But he still missed her. He still wished she could see what he had accomplished. As he sat there, lost in thought, he heard a soft voice behind him. "Father." He turned around, his heart leaping. It was her. The girl. She was standing there, just as she had been that first night, her bright eyes glowing in the moonlight. "You came back," he said, his voice trembling. She smiled. "I told you I would." He stood up, tears streaming down his face. "I've missed you," he said. "Every day." She nodded. "I know. But you've done so well. You've changed the world, just like I knew you would." He felt a surge of emotion, a mix of joy and sorrow. "I couldn't have done it without you," he said. She reached out and took his hand. Her touch was warm, comforting. "You don't need me anymore," she said. "You have everything you need inside you. And you're not alone. You have the people. They believe in you. They'll stand by you." He looked at her, his heart swelling with love. "I'll never forget you," he said. She smiled. "You don't have to. I'll always be with you. In your heart. In the future you're building." And then, just like that, she was gone. The millionaire stood there, her words echoing in his mind. He felt a sense of peace, of closure. He knew she was right. He didn't need her anymore. He had found his purpose, his strength, and his love for the world. As he walked back to the community center, the snow falling softly around him, he felt a deep sense of gratitude. The girl had given him the greatest gift of all, the chance to change, to grow, and to make a difference. And he would spend the rest of his life honoring that gift.